need to consider the precedent that's being set here, which should not go overlooked entirely. And I'll just ask the rhetorical question of, are we now planning on setting a minimum wage for every industry that comes forward? Are we setting a new wage with expenses for all tech workers, for workers in the fast food industry, et cetera? We have to be looking at the consequences of what we're doing here.
Welcome, friends. David Griscom here, Left Reckoning 164. When you're a U.S. Stooge, they let you do it. And Fantano on Rap Beefs. Joined, as always, by my wonderful co-host, Matt Leck. How are you doing, brother?
I'm doing very well, David, and I am concerned that your mic may have just changed in the period that you opened.
Is this better? Is this better?
That is better. There we are.
I cannot stand this company anymore. I'm sorry. It's ridiculous. Anyway.
Call them out.
Call them out. Well, I don't know if I should be... I've been reading a little bit of scripture recently, because if you're hearing my voice and if you're listening to this program, it means that yesterday afternoon you were not called to join our Lord in everlasting paradise. You were, in fact, left with the rest of us and were left out of the rapture. Very sad about that. I thought I certainly was going to be one of the chosen few, but at least seeing everyone else out here, seeing the folks who are still around, means that I don't know. There's still some people I can look down on. So I don't know, Matt. I mean, I know y'all had a little bit of an eclipse up in New York. We were in full totality here, but I think like a lot of other places had a lot of cloud coverage, which was a little bit disappointing.
We were not direct, and it was cloudy, and I had to publish Majority Report at that time, so I kind of like looked at it. Actually, no, I'll be honest. I tried to last minute make a little one out of a Ritz Crackers box.
Wait, what?
you put but it's an indirect one. It's a 5-minute method I found on YouTube, and it didn't work very well. So I gave up almost immediately after I realized I just ruined the box for no reason, and went on with my day. So that was my experience.
Well, I mean, I think there was some. I mean, I will just say I had a very nice time actually, and I was very lucky in the sense that the clouds opened up right before it started, and I got to see the whole thing, and it was something truly spectacular. It was very, I don't know. It was certainly an experience to sit there and everything going as dark as it did. I've never been in full totality before, so I had a very nice time. But the eclipse was funny because it was like this is big news. This is a big experience, and a lot of people sort of have a hard time admitting something like that. That like, hey, this was an interesting astrological event. It's worth appreciating. And I think
you're wild if you're in the zone of totality and you don't go out to look at it, right?
Oh, totally. Well,
like, that's crazy.
Well, talking about that, but some people do have to work, right, Matt? And that's, a difficult thing.
Yeah.
So, so some people, hey, here's the thing. Some people make money during these kind of things. Hey, if you own a hotel and you're in totality, that's very nice. Restaurants, a lot of places did fairly well. Were able to make some money during this most recent eclipse. But there's one guy I really want to take a moment, to celebrate because he really was having a lot of fun with the solar eclipse. And that was none other than Austin legend himself, Mr. Alex Jones, who had been pushing a lot of very wild conspiracy theories about the solar eclipse, including this one, which comes from like an 8-minute long video. That I found to be very interesting.
Scenario seems unlikely. This eclipse season is, however, a very rare event. The recent eclipses in August of 2017 and October of 2023, along with the upcoming one on April 8th, forms an Aleph and a Tav over the United States. The Aleph and Tav are the first and last letters of the Hebrew alphabet, the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. These eclipses mark the end of the great year, a 26,000-year period
Yeah, it was very
that
significant.
starts anew with the dawning of Aquarius and a new golden age. Manly P. Hall wrote that high-level...
This goes on for another 10 minutes.
I just love the American centricness of that. Like, of course, it's going to be Hebrew letters, but it'll be over America. Like, of course, because America is the new center of the world, and God, of course, understands that.
No, and totally. So, Alex Jones was pushing all kinds of stuff, which of course he was. But it just is always amazing to me how, like, there's never any, need to sort of follow through on the other side, right? Because, it's Tuesday. I don't know what was supposed to happen when an A went over America. But, things are feeling pretty normal. I did spend a little bit too much time diving into Alex Jones's theories about this. But there was basically a theory that, like, even if nothing happens, right, which is always great, that, the bad people are actually using this to sort of hone their power. So you should certainly be extra worried. But, Alex Jones being, a guy who has a, pretty well-off media empire, didn't want to work on, the Eclipse, wanted to take the day off, much like myself. I want to go out and see it and experience it for himself. So he brought in the B team to take over the live coverage of the Eclipse on the Alex Jones show on InfoWars. And look, I'm not suggesting people go and watch a bunch of Alex Jones stuff, but it is very funny to watch this entire 45-minute long coverage of the Eclipse, or just skip around it. Because these guys basically have to find a way. Like, it's boring enough when the local news comes and they get like a 3-minute segment of like, oh, look, a bunch of people are in the park hanging out. But these folks here, they have to find a way to talk for 45 minutes about the Eclipse without the gravitas or the persona of Alex Jones being there. So this is live from, I believe, Zilker Park here in Austin, where the InfoWars guys were basically bothering people on the side of the road who were enjoying the Eclipse. But anyways, let's hear a little bit of what their coverage was like.
So one of the other things when I look at this eclipse that I don't hear or see anywhere is it's a reminder of the divine creation in which we exist. I mean, it's a reminder of the true excellence of this creation of God that we're in. And when you talk to the astrology people, I don't know if they shared any religious beliefs or whatever, but to me this is beyond religion. This is proof of creation. I mean, even believing in these astrological symbols, to me, is like admitting that, yeah, you're in a divine creation. There's an intelligent designer of all this. These things have meaning. The eclipse has meaning. Do you get any sense of that? Are people out there just in awe, like you were saying, like, wow, look at what God has made. This is God's clock. Look at how perfect it is. The sun, the stars, the moon, the earth, all aligning in perfect completion. Do you get any of that?
Sure. Well, as you very well know, Owen, Austin is a very secular city, for lack of a better term. But I will say that seeing all of these families here has definitely evoked a sense of team humanity. The conversation that we have frequently with Alex on InfoWars, and of course the conversation that he had with Elon Musk about team humanity. And
so, a very, very normal afternoon for all the folks at InfoWars, watching a bunch of families playing and just sort of getting a little giddy, which is, again, very normal thing, and happy to have that in the community for sure.
I mean, you could, if you could fill time. I mean, it's weird having to do that, but also have it be insane. Because I mean, you could just go.
Well, because you got to pick one, though. I'm sorry, you got to pick one. It's either this is like the proof of satanic rituals that are coming. The devil's here, right? The lizard people are coming, or it is proof of God's immense power. And the beauty of team humanity.
Look, I was raised Catholic. I'm not a church going person, not a believing person, but I can't help, maybe that's my Catholic upbringing, but feel like this sort of thing where Marjorie Taylor Greene's talking about these things as like signs, like that seems like not religious to me. That seems more almost close to pagan, or like, I don't know, maybe I don't want to police people's religious beliefs, but to look at the eclipse and be like, God is talking to me. Is that in the Bible? Maybe it is. Maybe
I don't know. Well, anyways, folks, glad that some people got the day off, or skipped work. We love that too. We're going to be talking to our friends Kurt and Jose in just 1 second. But before we do that, let's do a quick shout out here, Matt. We have this video, something to celebrate here, which is this announcement from the United Auto Workers. And I'll just play this video here because what's going on here is, I think, again, I said it last week, I think one of the most important things happening in American politics, at least, and certainly in the American labor movement. Come up in 1 second.
I love our new laggy video system. There we go.
Yeah, it's great.
It's time for change at Mercedes.
It's time for justice in Alabama.
It's time for Mercedes workers to stand up.
Working class people have the power to change the world. That's what you're fighting for right now. Work-life balance, good health care that you can afford, a better life for your family, a better life for all of Alabama. And the first thing you need to do to achieve that is you gotta believe you can win. That this job can be better, that your life can be better, and that those things are worth fighting for. That's why we stand up. Faith the size of a mustard seed, as Scripture says, can move mountains. But right here in Alabama, at Mercedes, we got another mountain to move. Because deep down, I know you believe it's possible. There is a path. But you have to walk the path to victory. And hundreds of thousands of UAW members all over this country, we have your back. Are you ready to stand up? Yes! Are you ready to fight for what you deserve? UAW! So let's walk down that path to victory together in solidarity, and let's finish this job.
So we're keeping our eyes on the ball here. When there's going to be a lot of distractions in American politics over the next few months, as we prepare for the clown show that will be the presidential election in this country, let's remember the elections that matter. And this fight here at the Mercedes plant is a massive fight for workers in this country, and particularly for workers in the South. Because for far too long, the major auto companies in this country have tried to pit working people against each other, to pit workers in the North versus workers in the South against one another. Having the confidence and the capability and the passion to bring that fight right down to the South, to say, hey, you know what, we're not going to take excuses anymore and say, hey, we're going to accept bad contracts from, the big three in Detroit or wherever, because, we're afraid that they'll just move the jobs down to Tennessee, Alabama, etc. No, we're going to fight where we're at, and we're also going to expand this movement. And I just can't say enough how inspiring and important this movement has been. If you look at the kind of difficult place that we are in American politics, one of these shining lights and one of the alternatives to not just doing kind of replays of the Bernie Sanders campaign over and over and over again is actually seeing this mobilization in labor here.
Yeah, 100%.
Do you want to shout out our friends before we?
Okay, yeah, I was gonna save it, but I can't wait. Our buddies, David Story had this tweet that of him and Adam Keller were at a classroom here. Let me just post this over. Adam Keller, local IATSE member and famous co-host of Labor Reporters, and I were about to talk about union opportunities in the community to a group of robotics and industrial maintenance students today, and it couldn't have went better. And there's Adam there at the Lawrence County Career and Technical Center, and you love to see that, folks. That is higher education, as far as I am concerned.
I think well put. Well, let's bring on our guest here. We're going to be talking a bit about Mexico and this pretty brazen move by Ecuador against the Mexican embassy. But before we get into that, let's introduce our friends here. We're joined by Kurt and Jose. I mean, Kurt's been on this program many times. Y'all are the hosts of an excellent new podcast. Would y'all like to introduce yourselves to the audience and tell them about the new show?
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. Pleasure to be back on, and a pleasure to be back on as well with José Luis. So my name is Kurt Hackbarth. I write for Jacobin Magazine and for Sentido Común Magazine here in Mexico. And together with José Luis, we've recently launched a new podcast called Soberania, which is the Spanish word for sovereignty. YouTube, it's on Spotify, and it's on Apple Podcast. We're just getting our sea legs in this, but I think we're doing reasonably well to start. The goal of the podcast is to bring news and analysis from a grassroots and left perspective about what's going on in Mexico to an English-speaking audience. I've been writing on Mexico for many years now, as has José Luis, who has experience in Mexico and in Ecuador and working for various different media outlets. And as we've talked about on the show, right, we have our dumb article by the New York Times every single time we come on. The coverage of Mexico over the 5.5 years of López Obrador has just been absolutely dreadful. And part of this you can chalk up to just poor reporting, sloppy reporting, cutting back on the budgets of newsrooms, cutting back on investigations and editing and the like. And part of it simply is that corporate media is the soft power arm of imperialism. And that's just the way it is. And in that, any kind of appeal to improve their journalism is not going to work, because that's not their role. Their role is not to provide good journalism. It's to be an arm of American soft power, right? And we saw this very recently with this barrage of attacks against AMLO starting in January. Just to put in the context, Mexico is going to presidential elections at the beginning of June. So Mexico is in presidential election season right now. So just very quickly, recap, in January, the Baker Institute, up by you guys there in Texas, came out with its Mexico report for 2024, claiming no proof that Mexico's center-left party, Morena, López Obrador's party, was going to be in cahoots with organized crime in these upcoming elections. And then that was, picked up by the Texas Observer, who did an interview with the head of the Mexico Center, Tony Payan. And then that jumped the fence, as it does, and was published here by the Reforma newspaper and then spread out. A couple of weeks after that, on the same day, there are 3 articles by ProPublica, by Deutsche Welle, by Insight Crime, rehash a closed investigation into AMLO's 2006 campaign, saying that there was drug money, or the attempt to bring drug money into AMLO's 2006 campaign, which had been, the investigation had never gone anywhere and was closed because, at the time, they had to even admit that prosecutors were underwhelmed. A couple weeks later, not to be left out, the New York Times comes out with a piece saying that there was drug money in AMLO's 2018 campaign, right? This is a pilloried article because it had nothing. It had nothing. It was full of this person said, a source said, that person said, that somebody else said that, just an awful piece of journalistic malpractice, right in the time when the New York Times is under the gun for its Israel coverage, its Palestine coverage, Annette Schwartz, and all of that. So all these articles were then picked up and then, injected into the social media mainstream by a, multi-million-dollar campaign that said it's Narco AMLO, Narco Claudia Sheinbaum is the presidential candidate now, Narco Morena, Narco everything, because the big thing now is, it's not new, is to just tar any progressive Latin American candidate or president as a narco, as we're seeing as well right now in Ecuador, which I'm sure we can get into. So, it got to the point where there are like 20 million tweets, hundreds of millions of views. AMLO joked at the time that it was even more than the Super Bowl, the narco president or the narco AMLO hashtag, based on all these bogus articles from the U.S. Press. So that is part of the explanation of why we launched this podcast, right? To get the news out there beyond this, this constant nonstop media barrage. And there's been a bit of a happy ending in this. With all this media barrage that I just pointed out, AMLO's approval rating went up 11 points over that period. So people are sick of it. People are sick of it. Crap.
Yeah, and I mean the show's great, and I'm really happy it's out there. There's links below, so people can find it. I mean, I know Kurt, as his name implies, was very quick there with the introduction. I don't know if there's anything that you'd like to add other than your introduction, Jose, to the audience here, so that they can get to know your voice as well.
I think that's a great introduction. That's what we're trying to do. And what makes me really happy is that it seems like we're finding an audience. It seems like people are interested in learning about this other narrative about Mexico. A little bit about myself. I'm José Luis Granados Ceja. I'm a Mexican-born journalist living and working here in Mexico City. And I'm staff writer at Venezuela Analysis, which some of you might be familiar with. I also do the podcast over there. And I'm also the editor of the Mexico Solidarity Media website, which is a different initiative, connected, some of the same people, just trying to get out that different story about what's happening here in Mexico. And I think to add one thing to what Kurt was saying, we've seen these comments on our YouTube page of everybody saying, like, finally something in English about Mexico that provides a different perspective. The truth is that, if you read the mainstream media, it's the same kinds of voices, Jorge Castañeda, Carlos Bravo Regidor, people who don't really understand this country, just totally out of touch with what had happened in this country in 2018 when López Obrador was elected, why it actually does represent a watershed moment. And I think it's deliberate. I think they're trying to make it so people don't know about what's happening in Mexico, because if they did, they might actually be inspired by it. Right. I think there's a deliberate effort to make it seem like, well, Mexico's this faraway place, so the only thing you should know about it is that it's got nice beaches and it's full of violence and drugs. Right. When the truth is there's a really profound movement here in this country that is benefiting the marginalized, the poor majority, the working class. Right. I think it sums it up in his slogan. And I don't want to sound too biased here, but I think it really captures it, which is, for the good of everybody, the poor come first. Right? Imagine a U.S. politician coming out there and saying, let's put the poor first once in a while, And this is the slogan of the government. So I think people should pay attention to what's happening in Mexico. And this podcast is just one way for us to get that information out there.
Yeah, no, I mean, seriously, I've really enjoyed, I've enjoyed it since its launch. We've tried to share some of those videos here, and we'll keep on doing it. But people should definitely, everyone listening right now should subscribe immediately. And I'll just say, as a side note, it's always wild to me how, I don't know, I don't want to be insulting, but like uninformed sometimes a lot of like American leftists can be about Mexico, particularly ones who might have a decent understanding of a lot of other countries, certainly in Europe, but even in the Americas. It is always sort of shocking that, our direct neighbor doesn't get as much play, other than y'all's excellent work on the American left. And I think that really, really needs to change, especially at a moment like this, when we're seeing some gains and those need to be defended. I want to talk a little bit about like what's going on politically in Mexico and the presidential election. But I just think that it's impossible not to start with this pretty brazen and shocking event in Ecuador. And I'm going to play a little bit of this video here. That is from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or tweeted out by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Mexico, sort of outlining this attack by Ecuadorian authorities on the Mexican embassy in Ecuador. And I'm sure all of our listeners understand that, under international law, an embassy is sovereign territory of another nation. Okay. You cannot go and invade it. You cannot go and tear through it, jump over the walls. I mean, this is a brazen attack on Mexican sovereignty, on international norms. But I'll just play a little bit of this video and then throw to y'all. There's a lot we can sort of kick off here. I mean, could y'all sort of set the stage for some of the folks out there who might not have seen this news? What was it that we were just watching there?
Sure. I'll
you want to start? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think actually to explain what happened here, we have to go back to much earlier in Ecuadorian politics. And to make a long story short, we had Rafael Correa elected. He leads the transformation of his country. He has to step down after his second term. They end up tapping Lenin Moreno, his first vice president, to run in his place. And it turns out that this guy's a traitor. He betrays the movement, he betrays the party, he betrays the mandate. He starts to rule with the old regime. And it is the start of a political witch hunt that persists to this day through various presidents, Lenin Moreno, Guillermo Lasso, who followed him, and now Daniel Noboa. And so what we saw on the screen here, this effort by Ecuadorian security forces to violate international law, violate the Vienna Convention, to storm the embassy of Mexico in Quito, to arrest Jorge Glass. Jorge Glass was Ecuador's vice president under Rafael Correa in his second term and under Lenin Moreno. In fact, Lenin Moreno, one of the first things he does that made it really clear what his agenda was actually strip him of all his powers, and then eventually engages in this lawfare campaign against him. And so they've been stacking up these trumped-up charges against him and everybody to do with the citizens' revolution in Ecuador, everybody related to the Correísta movement, as it's sometimes called. Many other politicians have had to take refuge in the Mexican embassy. Many of them are living in Mexico right now because they cannot go back for fear of persecution. Again, by successive presidents, this is now like a state-led policy of persecution of Rafael Correa. Why? Because his movement, the Citizens' Revolution, it's the strongest political force in the country. And so because they can't, continue to implement their agenda, their pro-Washington neoliberal agenda, they go after the forces that are obviously the ones that are capable of actually putting up a resistance, alongside with a very well-organized indigenous movement in Ecuador as well. And so what this was is that after, a bit of a diplomatic spat in the week previous, Jorge Glass had been in the embassy since December, if I'm not mistaken. He had requested a safe passage to be able to make it to the airport and come to Mexico because Mexico agreed to give him asylum. They determined that he was being politically persecuted, even though he's charged with common crimes, that these were not, in fact, actually motivated by the pursuit of justice, but actually pursued or motivated by political persecution. And so in this extraordinary event, Daniel Noboa, which I think the current president, which you note is the son of one of the richest men of Ecuador, a banana oligarch, makes this decision to raid and then we should be clear about this, he wasn't arrested because you can arrest somebody where you have jurisdiction. The Ecuadorian National Police does not have jurisdiction inside the Mexican embassy. They kidnapped him. And they kidnapped him, and now he is jailed and in very difficult medical situation, as I understand it. We're talking about trying to save his life at this point. Mexico has made the decision to break diplomatic relations and is going to take them to The Hague, to the World Court. And there's some pressure for one of the demands to be, hand over Jorge Glass. We have already decided that we're giving him political asylum. You kidnapped him. You must return him, because it's about trying to save his life at this point.
Mm. And just I want to throw to you, Kurt, here, but it's notable too that this is Mexico, in the sense that like Mexico has a tradition of standing up for political prisoners internationally. This is a part of like the Mexican tradition, something that AMLO has been very passionate about. But yeah, I mean, could you talk a little bit about the fallout here, and some of the world response?
Yeah, sure. So I just wanted to pick up on your point, which is very important. Mexico has a very long and proud history of receiving people in asylum, and people have been persecuted. And that goes back to people fleeing Franco and the Republicans from the Spanish Civil War, as well as, the whole host of U.S.-sponsored dictatorships across the Southern Cone. So Mexico received thousands of people from Chile after Pinochet, Argentina after Videla, Uruguay, Brazil. So many people over that time, and that's part of Mexico's national character, right? So, this should be a no-brainer for people, right? For every country in the world, this should be a no-brainer that, as you said at the outset, embassies are sovereign territory and cannot be violated. That's the Vienna Convention. That's the Caracas Accords. This is very clear. There has been international condemnation of this, and it's very interesting. Even Argentina's Javier Milei condemned this, right? And this is something that not even Pinochet and Videla did, which is violate an embassy, right? It's practically unheard of, right? So what were the two countries that were particularly tepid about this? Can we guess? One of them is a two-word country, and the other one is the country just north of it, right? So this happens on Friday night. The United States takes a whole day the next day to respond, right? While, Ambassador Ken Salazar is tweeting, being at social events and, other nonsense, right? Finally, the State Department comes out on Saturday with a tepid statement saying, we condemn any violation of the Vienna Convention, right? Not this one in particular, just any violation, which is the easiest possible thing you could say, right? Mm-hmm. And encourage Mexico and Ecuador to resolve their differences, which is basically putting the aggressor and the victim of aggression on the same footing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, in this paternalistic tone, oh, you little countries, work out your differences, right? That's like telling a victim of domestic abuse, oh, work things out with your abuser. Just work it out, right? Followed by Canada, which we can't expect any better, and there wasn't any better. Then says, at least it mentions the case and said there was an apparent violation, right? Apparent. But then on to parody, or plagiarize American language, saying resolve your differences and whatever else. Interestingly, AMLO raised the tone just today at his morning's press conference and said very clearly, Ecuador would not have done this if they didn't know that they had the support of other powers. They wouldn't have just done this on their own if they know they didn't have, he didn't say the U.S., but it was obvious he was talking about the U.S., if he didn't have the U.S. behind it. And he released the security camera footage, which is in the video that you just ran. Interestingly, just a few hours ago, the White House spokesman comes out with a much stronger statement, actually condemning what happened and mentioning the Vienna Convention and saying what they should have said on Saturday. So it's interesting now that the White House is in a different place than the State Department, and that's AMLO's doing, right? So I just want to put this into a little bit more context too, because I think it's very important, right? Recently, Ecuador signed two security agreements with the United States. The outgoing government of Guillermo Lasso, which was just ratified by the Banana King, Noboa, right? One of them allows the presence of U.S. troops on Ecuadorian soil. The other one allows the U.S. Navy to operate in Ecuadorian territorial waters. Laura Richardson, everyone's favorite ghoul from Southcom, showed up in Ecuador recently to shake Noboa's hand and basically launch a new drug war in Ecuador, right? Because one of the, presidential candidates, Fernando Villavicencio, was killed in very suspicious conditions during the presidential campaign in October, which AMLO mentioned last week in his press conference. And then everybody who had anything to do with it were just strangely killed in jail. So that's the context of this, right? The United States looking to find another wedge in South America to prevent any possibility of Latin American unification, right? There's been a move over the last several years with Mexico providing a lot of the impetus to scrap the Organization of American States, which is, a Cold War U.S. relic, and replace it with something pan-Latin American and Caribbean, right? Be it the CELAC or something else, right? To try to get a degree of Latin American coordination and things. And what you're seeing is the United States saying, no way we're going to do that. And if we need a Milei in there, throwing bombs and getting Colombia to withdraw its ambassador, or if we need, Ecuador to storm an embassy to cause Mexico to break relations, well, then that's what we'll do. We'll just break up all possible connections that could be made. And my final point on this is it's no coincidence that it happened just a few days after Israel's bombing of the Iranian consulate in Damascus, right? I mean, the clear message from that is if you're a U.S. Stooge, you can do absolutely anything you want. Mm-hmm. You can bomb an embassy, you can kill a general, as they did over there, or in this case, you can just storm in and kidnap someone. Because what does it matter, right? So the question really is, did Ecuador get the explicit green light from the United States, or just an implicit, we know they'll support us, whatever we wind up doing.
And I'll just say this is that not being able to, know the mind of the Biden administration, you have to sort of operate from a few different principles about what's possible or not here. The But it's like one, if the Biden administration is giving a green light as as one version, that's obviously extremely dark. American history of meddling in the rest of the world, very, very bad history there. Or the other one, right, which is also a likelihood that the Biden administration is effectively sleepwalking through crisis after crisis, crisis of the mass slaughter in Gaza, to something like this, where you are actually like watching things around, right? So there is no version of this that comes off making the Biden administration's policy look good.
But we should contrast it with, we talked to Brian Meyer about when the U.S. was alert to Bolsonaro and the transition of power there. They did send strongly worded, cables and things like that, and so they were on the ball there. So, I'm whether it was a yellow light or a green light, there's some intentionality here. I think we can say.
Yeah, I would. I would agree with that, and I think it is again noteworthy that AMLO comes out and says what he says this morning, plays that footage, and gets the White House to respond tardily, 4 days. But we seem to be that close to it.
No, I mean, I think that this is maybe a good segue here to talk about the election coming up, because, in addition to all the things that AMLO has done domestically, I think, one thing that is very notable and it's not talked about, enough actually is like AMLO internationally, because of the role that he's been able to play internationally, because of his popularity within Mexico. It is something that is meaningful to have a leader, who's not from the United States or Canada, who is able to have some influence on a global map. So we've done a decent amount of coverage of the Mexican election on this program. So we've introduced the main candidates, so we don't have to go into all of their backstory here. But could y'all sort of maybe catch people up as to what the most recent events? I know there was a debate recently. What are the major issues here going into this election? We're, by the way, just again, for people who don't know, AMLO is not running for re-election. It's a one-term system in Mexico.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think the debate is a good place for us to kind of jump off. What we have is very simple. There are 3 candidates, but really only 2 have any kind of a realistic chance. And it's the Morena-led coalition, the party founded by López Obrador that took him into the National Palace in 2018, Claudia Sheinbaum. And then there's the opposition coalition, which is a bit of a Frankenstein kind of mishmash of ideologies. I call it a forced marriage. It's the PRI, the infamous PRI that ruled Mexico nearly uninterrupted for 70 years. Then the PAN, which was elected in 2000. The PRI returns in 2012. And the PRD, which is kind of it's a rump party. It's not really anything left, right? So basically, it's the coalition of the old regime versus Morena and its coalition. The candidate of the opposition is named Xochitl Gálvez. And, it's interesting because Morena went through a whole selection process. The way that they do it, they don't have a primary. They have polls where they try to see who is the candidate that most popular with the population. And ultimately, that's secured by Claudia Sheinbaum. But Xochitl Gálvez is hand-chosen. So they kind of went through the motions of trying to pretend like they were going to have a system to select, but ultimately they didn't even carry through with the last of the steps that they had needed to take. They made the decision that Xochitl Gálvez was going to be the candidate because they thought they could pull a fast one on the Mexican population. They're like, well, she's the daughter of an indigenous man, an Otomi man. She comes from humble roots. Truth is, she's extraordinarily wealthy. She became even more wealthy thanks to her connections to the government in the 2000s. She represents this old regime. And so it hasn't really fooled anybody. If you look at the polls consistently, Claudia Sheinbaum is 20 to 30 to even 35 points ahead. It's a gap that's not going to be able to be closed. There was a lot of hope that the debate would turn things around for Xochitl Gálvez. She needs to have an absolute stellar 10 out of 10 performance. She actually did very, very poorly. She didn't really accomplish any of the things that she needed to do during that debate. And I think the story's largely been written on this one. I don't think the polls are going to close very much at all. Maybe a point here, maybe a point there. It very much looks like Claudia Sheinbaum is going to be elected president. She's going to be the first woman president, a Jewish woman, in fact. And it is about continuing López Obrador's political project. That's what the election is basically about. Do you want continuity or do you want to go back to the old regime? And I think it's overwhelmingly clear that the Mexican population is in favor of the changes that López Obrador implemented. I mean, there's a lot of them, but basically think of it as a massive expansion of the welfare state. a real effort to, like I said at the beginning, put the poor first, to attend to the needs of the working class, increase the minimum wage, make unionization efforts easier, democratize unions, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of progressive bona fides. And like you mentioned, a less subservient role in the hemisphere when it comes to international politics, et cetera, et cetera. That's basically what she's running, a classic front runner strategy, saying, vote for me. It's more of what you like about this government. And in fact, one of the things she talks about is also kind of the second floor, like expanding on what we've already been doing. And the opposition doesn't really have a coherent project. They mostly are listening to these angry pundits who are also very Washington centric. I've read a number of articles lamenting López Obrador's foreign policy. Oh, we've lost our place, when actually we have improved in the eyes of the rest of the world, especially the global South, right? We began this program talking about the efforts that the government has done to protect the lives and the political forces in Ecuador, when not too long ago, they did similarly in Bolivia, literally rescuing Evo Morales from likely death, right? So I think the voters are going to reward López Obrador's party by electing Claudia Sheinbaum come June 2nd.
Yeah, I would just add very briefly to that knowing that it's very, very likely that Claudia Sheinbaum is going to win and be the next president-elect. Basically, the opposition is trying to shift the scene of conflict to the post-electoral arena, right? Xochitl Gálvez has said the day that she received her official nomination that perhaps violence in the country will make it impossible to carry out proper elections. It's not true, but it's just a way to try to, find a way to delegitimate the elections. Or they're trying to say, oh, certain things that López Obrador has said at his morning press conference has, violated the president's requirement to be impartial in the election, right? Et cetera, et cetera. They're finding ways to try to say, oh, well, maybe we're just going to have to invalidate this election. It's unlikely, right? But knowing that the National Electoral Institute in Mexico has been a partisan player over the last several years, and they continue to have, a lot of their people in there, plus the fact that the judicial branch in Mexico is, part and parcel, wholly owned by conservative interests in this country. You just got to know that they're going to try to create some kind of trouble between the Electoral Institute and the judicial branch to try to find a way to call the election into question, because in Mexico, the U.S. has got 50 different states fighting over elections, as we saw very clearly in the last election. In Mexico, it's got a federal electoral institute and a federal electoral tribunal, which can decide whether or not to validate an election, right? So really, the struggle is going to be there in these institutions that are captured by the Mexican right. López Obrador has said very clearly, if they're even going to try to do that, that means letting the tiger out. And the tiger is a reference dating back to the Mexican Revolution of the Mexican people. The Mexican people is the tiger. So basically, don't mess with the tiger if you're going to try to play these kind of games. But that's where we have to be very pending the night of the election and the weeks following, not just the election itself, but the qualification of the election judicially.
Well, it's sort of interesting, and again, I highly suggest people check out all the episodes of y'all's new show. But the stuff about the Bankers Institute, it does sort of matter, right? Because in the U.S. at least, there is this attempt ever since AMLO won in the first place, to treat this government as if it's like a cartel front. To just be blunt about the way it's talked about in the United States, and I think in a way that is always sort of, at this point, I can't be surprised by it, but it does sort of move me a little bit to just see how quickly a lot of liberals will swallow this kind of thing. Maybe we just need to present it to them as like, hey, you remember when Trump tried to do January 6th? It seems like the Mexican right might want to do that there. Maybe that will get some of those folks to pay a little bit more attention. But I just think there's no way, other way to say it than like in the United States. I think there is already kind of groundwork, and I'm not trying to get conspiratorial and say something like that's going to happen. But there is certainly an attempt to get Americans in general, but particularly some American liberals who might pay attention to international issues, to sort of get comfortable with the idea of a very clearly, an election that looks very clear, getting really murky.
Yeah, And you don't even have to be particularly conspiratorial to see, for example, in a 1 month period, the Baker Institute, ProPublica, Deutsche Welle, Inside Crime, and the New York Times all coming out with articles that AMLO was a narco in every single one of his presidential campaigns. What are the odds that all of those outlets were all working on those pieces at the exact same time on campaigns that dated back over a decade? And it's funny that the ProPublica piece got so much blowback that the editor of ProPublica, Stephen Engelberg, had to come out and basically try to defend the piece. And what he allowed at the end was that the DEA, and he said this, the DEA asked for changes in the piece and asked for the piece to be postponed, the publication of the piece to be postponed. Stephen Engelberg said this. You don't have to be particularly conspiratorial here. The hands of U.S. intelligence agencies are all over this election. And it's funny that in this recent chapter with Ecuador that we just talked about, before it was Narco President AMLO, right? Narco Presidente. Actually, they spelled some things wrong in the hashtags, which allowed people to trace where these bot farms were coming from. Right? Now, the new hashtag is Narco Embajadas de AMLO, AMLO's narco embassies. You see, this is all chapter 2, what's going on with Ecuador. It's chapter 2 or chapter 3. Now they're saying AMLO is using international embassies to harbor criminals and harbor narcos, right? Part of AMLO's nefarious international web of drug trafficking and embassies, And it sounds almost humorous, but that's part of the way this works, right? This idea of constantly trying to paint AMLO or any progressive in Latin America as a drug lord, knowing that the English language public will eat it up because that's all they're ever fed about Mexico, that everybody's on drugs here. Everybody's a drug dealer. Everybody's violent. Everybody's shooting everybody. That's all he's ever said, right? So it's very easy for conservatives and liberals, right, to just simply take that step and say, oh, AMLO has to be, because they all are, right? Yeah. From the conservative side, you get bomb Mexico and fentanyl and this and that. And it's interesting that Laura Richardson said now fentanyl is going to expand through all of Latin America, she just said, which gives the green light for the U.S. to act anywhere to stop it. Mm-hmm. But then you've got these well-meaning, hand-wringing liberals saying, well, Mexico's democratic process is not good, and it's becoming authoritarian, and the Electoral Institute, and by golly, we have to do something. So I don't know what's worse, right? The kind of or this liberal hand-wringing about Mexico's democratic institutions, and we have to do something.
Well, it's an incredible combination sometimes of, that kind of typical liberal hand-wringing and just like pure ignorance. I mean, one of my favorites is this kind of implication of, like AMLO is a misogynist, right? So that's why we should support, maybe the right-wing candidate winning the election, obviously omitting the fact of Scheinbaum's gender as well, right? And it's just, it's just shocking to me how brazen a lot of this stuff is. I have a specific question before I want to talk a little bit more about like some of the policies and things that are really moving people, because just because they're popular doesn't mean we should zero in on them. I'm curious though, how does the Mexican right respond to some of the demonization of Mexico from my governor here in Texas to things like Joe Biden's promise to expand border militarization. I mean, how does the Mexican right sort of respond or rhetorically interact with that part of American politics?
Well, I would say that if we look at the Ecuador incident, in fact, one of the few voices out there that was actually backing Noboa's decision was some of the right-wing punditry in this country. And so I think a lot of them are very Washington-centric, or it's interesting you bring up the case of the Texas governor in particular, right? There has to be some posturing, right? I think one of the deeply ingrained values in the political culture here is sort of a kind of a very anti-imperialist consciousness of a willingness to say, defend our sovereignty. Historically, it's been very important. There's literally a museum here in Mexico City that's called the Museum of Interventions, right? So it's a very vivid part of the historical memory in this country, right? And so in some ways, they have to kind of posture and pretend like they too will defend the Mexican nation. But ultimately, who are they actually speaking to, right? We should talk about the election, and then the election in the context of the election. Xochitl Galvez goes to Washington, goes to New York. She meets with these right-wing think tanks. She meets with officials from government and administrations, right? She's the one who also admits later on that the New York Times board was pressing her about whether or not she believed that there was drug money in López Obrador's campaign and stuff like that. There is very much a bending of the knee by the right here to the interests of U.S. imperialism, and I think that's been pretty consistent, right? And I think that helps explain why there is so much antagonism across the political spectrum in the United States towards López Obrador, is because those interests have been affected, right? There has, I will name a kind of a handful of them, but like the defense of the resources in this country, of the sovereign right to exploit the oil industry here by the state-owned oil company, right? To roll back those efforts of privatization, to roll back those efforts to permit the penetration of U.S. capital in that industry, right? So there's been that. There's been AMLO's efforts to constrain the DEA and its ability to operate in this country. They basically virtually had free reign in this country before. And he's like, no, you're not allowed to operate the way that you have been. Everything that you do has to be reported. You can't have guns. You're not allowed to have a plane anymore. They were operating as if they were a law enforcement agency inside of Mexico. So that's why you also see this pushback, why you see the DEA constantly leaking things to these journalists, right? And they would very much like to see the opposition back in power, because they know that if Xochitl Galvez, like we said, she's not likely going to win, but if she did, she would return to that kind of U.S.-centric, right? We have to remember Mexico was part of the Lima group, which was that ad hoc group that tried to engage in regime change in Venezuela, right? And so that's the logic of the opposition, of maybe posturing, but mostly just conceding to the interests of U.S. imperialism in Mexico and Latin America more broadly.
Well, I was wanting to maybe kind of zero in on, and so we've talked a lot about AMLO's presidency on this program and some of the extremely significant things, lifting people out of poverty, taking on international efforts to sort of take over Mexico's extractive industries and things of that nature. It seems like the message from Sheinbaum's campaign is really resonating with folks. But for some people who might have not experienced, what is the message that is working so well, particularly policy wise, and on that too, I do have to ask this, as a socialist here, I'm curious about how both of y'all see Morena's role in kind of civil society. And building up power for regular everyday people to not just come out and vote for these candidates, but to actually have more power and mobilization in their life. But yeah, so a little bit on the policies that are sort of resonating with people and how it's sort of playing out in society at large.
Yeah, maybe we can kind of tag team on this, because we were both at the launch for Claudia Sheinbaum on March 1st in Mexico City, which was a massive event. I think that's one of the more interesting aspects of covering Mexican politics is there's still this idea and there's still this ability to do mass party politics. So when you have a campaign launch, there were 350,000 people that showed up in Mexico City that day, which is, as I mentioned in my Jacobin article, that's like a New Orleans or a Cleveland, basically. So you get one of the world's biggest cities basically shuts down because Morena is coming to town, right? Delegations from, people marching from all different, parts of the city and they bust themselves in from different parts of the country, and flags and standards and bands and people dancing on the corner. So this is all the positive aspect of Morena's ability to turn people out, right? I think in the U.S. and Britain, Australia, whatever, we've long since lost this idea of mass party politics, right? What's happening now that's interesting is going through unions, as you were talking about beforehand, right? So that's the positive. The negative of Morena, and we have to say it, and we have to be very clear about this, is a phenomenon that's called chapulines, which are grasshoppers, which are people jumping in from other parties, right? Opportunists, right? And that has dampened some of this enthusiasm at the state and local level, right? So Morena at the federal level has been transformative. And I think we can talk about some of that, and maybe José Luis can go into some of Claudia's points and myself as well, Morena at the state and local level has not been as transformative, right? The state governments and the local governments have not been anywhere near at the standard of the federal government. And so you get opportunists with local fiefdoms and local power bases that say, well, Morena's going to sweep Morena across the board. So, ding, I'm the new candidate for Morena. Hello, right? And they just change their shirt or change their jacket, right? And there's been a lot of pushback at the local level because, the party president, Mario Delgado, has let this happen in far too many cases, right? These chapulines, right? So that's something that Morena is going to have to work out. Now, in Morena's defense, because I think I have to be clear about this, Morena was just founded in 2014. It's a very young party. In 4 years after it was founded, it won a presidential election and won the majority in Congress. So Morena didn't have a lot of incubation time to form a party structure. They basically had to form a party structure on the fly, on the run, while they were running a presidential campaign and getting into government, right? So Morena didn't have a lot of people, a lot of trained, people in its, in its ranks. So it did have to grab some people to govern from different places, just to run the federal government, right? But it's much less excusable this time that Morena is heading for a landslide election and you have all these chapulines coming in from other parties. So that's something Morena is going to have to work out its internal democratic process, which is something that every, left party in the world is, well, every party in the world, but, left parties everywhere have struggled with. And Morena is no exception. With regards to policies, that day of March 1st, Claudia Sheinbaum laid out a 100-point plan, which we don't have time to go into, I'm sure, in detail. But part of it is continuing on the policies of López Obrador, but with, different accents. For example, López Obrador instituted a 65 and over universal pension. Sheinbaum wants to drop that down to 60 for women in particular, because she knows that women many of the times are not in jobs where they've been able to accumulate formal employment where they've been able to accumulate a retirement fund or, tax, taking things out of your check whenever else. A lot of times women get to that age, and women who may have had to, divorce or are widowed don't have access to retirement funds, right? Sheinbaum wants to extend the 4T into the fourth transformation into places that simply AMLO didn't have the time to do. She's talking about building our public of letters and our public of readers, bringing arts and sports into Mexican schools, which by and large don't have them, right? She wants to set up a whole series of measures for women based on her experience in Mexico City, which is a women's hotline, which is women's prosecutors and prosecutors' offices dealing specifically with women-based crimes, right, to deal with things like feminicides and the like, right? So really putting an emphasis on women's issues as she has as mayor of Mexico City, right? She's an engineer. She's a climate engineer. One of her big projects as mayor of Mexico City was one of the world's largest urban solar panel installations on the roof of the Abastos market in Mexico City. So she wants to extend, climate change initiatives, but not through the greenwashing model that we've talked about on the show of private companies, cannibalizing Mexico's grid, through a public model. And that's going to be very important. She knows that Mexico is going to have to deal with the water crisis. Right now, Mexico's dealing in the whole world, but Mexico's dealing with a severe water shortage almost nationwide, right? And that has to do with a privatized water system where wealthy people and corporations and Coca-Cola and Danone and Nestle scooped up water licenses over the last 30 years. So hardly anything gets to domestic consumption, right? And so I think the advantage of Sheinbaum, and then I'll hand this over to José Luis, is she's really giving a perception of competence, of scientific competence, right? In this debate, you could see it, right? She answered the questions like this. She was actually, when the time clock wasn't working, she's saying, hey, listen, the time clock isn't working. She was calling the moderators out on slanted questions. She found time to, make some very targeted attacks at the opposition candidate. So you get the idea that Claudia Sheinbaum is a person who really has the technical competence to really grab hold of what López Obrador has called this rheumatic elephant, which is the federal government, which is this massive bureaucratic, thing, and that she can make it work to ends of social justice. So I don't know what you want to add to that, José Luis. There's so much more to say on this. Right?
No, I mean, to respond to the question in terms of like what has been the impact amongst the population, it's extraordinary to talk with people about the actual material improvements that have been made to their lives, right? That's the difference, is that it's very hard to convince people who have lived that transformation to vote for something else because they know the before and the after. There was a kind of an understanding that Mexico's modernization, its entry into global capitalism, the signing of the free trade agreement, it was supposed to bring prosperity. But a lot of people got left out. And the people who got left out, that's Morena's base, right? Now they feel included. Now they feel seen. And something like 7 out of 10 households benefit from at least one social program. So there's a senior who's collecting the pension, or there's a student who has one of the scholarships, right? Whatever it is, people are being impacted by this change in government policy. And so they're not likely to change their minds about it. It's interesting you use the word civil society here because it's actually kind of it's a term that's been co-opted by the right here, where they try to do what we call in the United States and Canada astroturfing, pretend that they're grassroots. But like Kurt said, when you actually consider what is the grassroots in Mexico, it's the hundreds of thousands of people who show up to a rally. And I think that's one thing that I would also emphasize, is that there really is a mass politics here. There is this still continued emphasis. It's not about the surveys, and it's not about the focus groups and all of this and about catering the message. It's about improving people's lives in a material way and mobilizing them on that basis and doing so successfully. One of the largest demonstrations that happened here was in defense of national sovereignty, in defense of the expropriation of the oil industry, in defense of the expropriation of lithium, because there is also a raised political level in a generalized way where people are like, yeah, those natural resources should be used by the state to redistribute to society so that we can have the things that we need. And there's a lot of buy-in, right? One of the early projects of the López Obrador administration was building highways in conjunction with communities, right? So a lot of the dirt roads, turning them into paved roads. And many communities, they're like, well, let's figure out how to do this efficiently. And if they had extra money, they would hand it back to the state to be like, use this for good, because this is what we've been waiting for, is a government that is actually serious about attending to the needs of the population. That's the big difference. That's what's been working for, and why so much of the opposition strategy isn't working, because you're trying to tell people to go against that, and it's not going to work. And I think there's a lot of lessons for activists and organizers throughout the world about that, right? I think a lot of it, yes, we need to figure out how do we reach people, but also like, what are we actually selling them? Are we convincing them that by supporting us, your lives are going to improve materially? I think that's really key. And it's obvious to anybody. I live in the Mexican capital. The differences are immense, right? I one of the ones I always highlight is I was doing a master's at the Autonomous University of Mexico City, which was founded by López Obrador. And it's meant to be accessible to people like myself, senior students, all that. Didn't pay a penny in tuition. And in fact, I received a stipend of 14,000 pesos, which is about what a professional makes upon graduating here in Mexico City, so that I could focus on my studies full time. And I would ride heavily subsidized public transit, right? The subway costs 30 cents here. They built these cable cars, or these gondolas that cross the marginalized parts of the city that cost 50 cents to ride. I mean, it's extraordinary. Just like those little things about, I could leave my house and board that gondola and go to a public park that was recently renovated and watch a free concert that was put on by the, we have Interpol playing here in the Capitol on April 20th, right? I'm a fan of indie rock, so that's going to be fun for me. And that's what it means. It means like, these are rights. This is about you actually being able to enjoy everything that the Constitution says you have a right to, which includes culture, which includes housing, education, healthcare, all of these things. There's still a long way to go. Healthcare being one of those. I think that's one of the ones, Kurt said AMLO didn't really have time to get to. I agree. There was an effort to do things early on in his term, and it didn't really work. But at least they said, okay, let's try this again. And things are getting better, right? I had a partner who had a really major surgery, that kind of thing that would have made us bankrupt in the United States. We didn't pay a penny, and it was top-notch care, right? It was they told us the hospital stay was maybe going to be 2-3 days, ended up being 5 or 6. Didn't matter, right? Even the food that they gave us was nice and nutritious. It's nice to see that that's what it means to redistribute wealth through the state. It's good to see it happening. And I think that's the sentiment in millions of households in this country.
Just to add a few things to that. Lopez Obrador recently launched a 20-point plan of constitutional reforms, right? That will continue. That process will continue through the next government. One of them is to give indigenous and Afro-Mexican communities what's called the status of public rights holders, which means that indigenous and Afro-Mexican communities would have more control over their natural resources and could participate in litigation efforts to defend their territory and defend their resources. This is something that goes back to the time of the Zapatistas and the 90s, and the famous San Andreas Accords that were never ratified at the time after the Zapatista uprising because of the conservative Congress refused to do that. Right, that would be very important for Mexico as well. Another one that's hitting that Mexico's going through a housing crisis, rising housing prices, just like in the U.S. Is a program to allow the Federal Housing Authority and Fonavit to build public housing. These things can actually happen. Build public housing, right? Not just depending on private stock. And then workers would then be able to rent a house. After 10 years in that house, all of the accumulated rent you pay would go into then you buying that house. So it's a rent to own policy on housing with public housing stock built by the Federal Housing Authority. This is something we'd like to see going forward. This one actually particularly excites a lot of us who are in exploitative renting conditions, right? Yeah, hello.
Oh, you're muted, David.
Sorry, I was just saying, who would have thunk it? Running on things that make people's lives better tends to work.
Kind of authoritarian.
It makes a party popular. It makes people want to vote for them. And I just, people. There are people who criticize AMLO from the right in the U.S. and from the left, and that's fine. All criticism is fair, but I don't think the U.S. left is in any position to turn up its nose against anyone at this point, right? Mm-hmm. Left isn't, and it's having its greatest moment historically. So maybe we could learn something from what's going on in Mexico. I just have a little bit of the humility to do that.
I think, particularly on the question of mass politics, which, not to get into it too deep, but unfortunately, I think our movement here has sort of, for whatever reason, started to turn their back on, which I think is a big mistake. But, folks, why don't you all tell folks how they can listen to Soberania? Did I get that all right?
Pretty good. Soberania. So actually, on the advice of the wonderful folks here at this program, we're kind of really emphasizing YouTube. So find us on YouTube, Soberania Podcast, but we're also on Apple and Spotify just to make it more accessible to everybody. But we're really kind of trying to build a little bit of a community here on YouTube. So come check us out. But it's also part of a larger project, which is the Mexico Solidarity Media Initiative, MexicoSolidarity.com, where we mostly put analysis, but sometimes some news as well about what's happening. A lot of the times what we're trying to do is just share things that were originally published in Spanish and get it translated so you can hear from different voices as well. There's a bunch of us that are writing and publishing in different spaces. I write occasionally for Al Jazeera. Kurt writes for Jacobin on a consistent basis. So we'll rerun things there. It's kind of a one-stop place to find information. And then there's also the Mexico Solidarity Project Bulletin. And you can sign up to that on MexicoSolidarity.com as well, or Mexico Solidarity Bulletin. You can Google those. And that's a weekly bulletin, comes out every Wednesday, and it's actually available bilingual. So it's in English and Spanish in case you have some friends and family that prefer to receive things in Spanish. You can tell them about it. And that's also where we get there's always original interviews and things like that. I write a monthly column there. It's a place to kind of continue this conversation, to talk about everything that we've been talking about today about Mexico from a different perspective, and honestly a more honest perspective, because what's going out there is really mostly journalistic malpractice.
Mm-hmm. Well, please go ahead.
No, just very quickly, any solidarity that comes from the heart of the empire is so important. It's so important that there are voices within the U.S. that give space to these kind of conversations, like you guys, or out there, defending Mexico's right to have its own transformation. Even if one doesn't agree with every single thing that's happening, it's their right to have their own transformation without constant U.S. intervention. And that's precisely why the podcast is called Soberania. It's precisely about sovereignty, right? Because this is something the United States constantly gets wrong, right? Deliberately, of course. But these are sovereign nations. These are sovereign nations with their own processes.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, Kurt, actually, because one of the objectives, one of the aims of the Mexico Solidarity Project is also to build a better relationship with the U.S. left, because we do need each other, right? I think I would call it the sovereignty dialectic. If you're going to defend sovereignty, you actually need anti-imperialists on the other side of the fence who are along there with you, because that's where the threat's coming from. That's the way to undermine it. At one point in the program, we talked about, it's a remote danger, but it is still a danger of there being an effort to not approve the results of the election. It would cause a civil war in this country. But if that does happen, like we saw, it wouldn't happen unless they got the go ahead from the U.S. Embassy. Right? Unless they got the go ahead from the State Department to go to this links. We talked a bit about kind of Biden. What are they really doing? And I think a lot of ways they will privilege stability over anything else. But even if they do get these wild ideas, and then there's a future threat, right? I've noticed in the chat, some people mention this as well, that there are very prominent, influential voices, especially in the right-wing media sphere, calling for an invasion, calling for unilateral military action against Mexico. We're talking about bombs falling on civilians inside of Mexico. It's extraordinary that this is a policy. But then again, I'm not surprised by things anymore, because look what just happened at the embassy. Look what's happening in Gaza. There's a genocide happening. Things you didn't think were possible are happening, and it could happen. Trump, in a way, needs that to rile up that racist, xenophobic base by talking about these kinds of things. And he may actually feel like he needs to carry out on it. There's a very real danger of that. And if that does happen, we're going to need you more than ever to actually go out there and engage in mass politics and say no to these kinds of things, and forget all of that indoctrination that, well, there are just a bunch of, drug dealers and narco traffickers down there, so who cares? No, there's very real lives that are going to be impacted by something like this. I always talk about this kind of in a tongue-in-cheek way, right? When they talk about using drones to destroy the drug labs in Mexico, it's not like the cartels have billboards on top of the building saying, like, we make meth here, right? We make fentanyl here. Of course not. These are embedded in communities. And if they do that, it would be catastrophic for our country. And I think would set back a lot of the progress we've made in terms of social advancements, right? And to destroy that example, like they did to Venezuela, right? Venezuela was a place where you look at everything they've been able to do, and they've lost a lot of the social gains because of the effects of the actions of U.S. imperialism. That's why we need you, and I really do appreciate having these kinds of spaces, because, chances are we probably agree in some of the places where we have some observations about how far this government has gone. But right now, it's about continuing to advance our collective interests as a working class, as the proletarians in the world.
Or hell, just having a better understanding of it than like, oh, is this the most radical dial that you could press, which is a very annoying thing with American leftists sometimes, where there's not a lot of context.
I grew up in the U.S. and Canada, and it's a pretty unique phenomenon here. Like, we all have had arguments here in Mexico, but not like that. Not the, like, I'm the most radical pissing contest. I don't get. It's a very uniquely North American phenomenon.
Well, it's because it's all in our head. I mean, when politics is all in your head, you spend a lot of time fighting goblins and ghouls. But friends, we really do appreciate y'all coming on the program. There are links below for people to follow y'all's work. And doors always open. Just real. When is the election?
June 2nd.
Sunday, June 2nd. Yeah.
Well, we'll be sure to have y'all back on after that to give us a recap. But till then, y'all follow the show, and thank y'all so much.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
All right, Matt. Well, I know we have one more. First of all, please y'all do subscribe. There are links below.
Yeah, and subscribe on YouTube too, especially with a new channel. Help them get their.
Just do it everywhere. Even if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc. As someone who does this, it really does help. And leave them a review, comments. Y'all know what to do. But shifting gears a little bit, Matt. Right?
Yeah. So, folks, I've been looking for a reason to have Anthony Fantano on the show. He was on the Michael Brooks show back in the day. And this Rick Rubin has been retweeting Mike Cernovich thing was my peg. We won't touch on that. If you want to hear that, we're going to release that for members. And then we also get Fantano talk about the streaming economics, and not great at the moment, folks. But this is really what I wanted to talk about, which has been on my mind for a couple of weeks now, is Kendrick Lamar's verse on future Metro Boomin's album, the song Like That. And I love it. I love everything about it. But like anything I enjoy that much, I start to be critical about it and wonder about the reasons why I'm enjoying it. And I think Fantano maybe throws a little bit of cold water on it. Maybe we don't need to go back and bring back we don't need to bring back the 50 Cent Ja Rule era of rap beefs, and I should maybe mature out of that. And part of me doesn't want to, and part of me really likes that Kendrick Lamar, because it is a lot of goofies with a check out here. But anyway, here's this interview, folks, and we'll have the post game show in about 30 minutes after this. So enjoy this sneak peek at my talk with Fantano as it loads up here. Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck, standing in alone without David Griscom today. With me, though, is the internet's busiest music nerd, Anthony Fantano of The Needle Drop. Anthony was actually a guest on the old Michael Brooks show. Folks might want to go revisit that from back in the day.
A while ago, so long ago.
Hear about Anthony's Bush era sort of political origin, or even around that time. But today we're going to talk about some politics. I do have a semi-relevant thing regarding Rick Rubin and if he's alt-right. But I actually want to talk to Anthony about what's really been on my mind these last few weeks, and that is the Kendrick Lamar diss verse on the future track. Like That, right? That was Like That. Yep.
Yeah.
And I have to say, like, I'll just put my cards on the table, because I'm kind of in and out on music generally. I was telling this to you. But hip hop has always been my favorite. But what I realized in the last few weeks is, like, I'm really into hip hop when it gets competitive and egos are on the line. Like the old 50 Cent Ja Rule stuff was kind of formative for me. Even Kendrick's Control thing. Even actually, the thing that impressed me most about Drake is his back-to-back kind of denial about ghostwriting. So I'm curious, am I wrong? Am I what's wrong that I start paying attention when this starts going on, Anthony?
No, I wouldn't say it's wrong per se. How old are you again?
I'm 35.
You're 30. Okay, so you're around the same age as me. I mean, you came up during an era where, like, beefs were a part of regular hip hop lore, that was, like, you know, a part of the culture regularly. And when beefs happened, they had consequences in terms of, like, you know, long-term perception of, you know, an artist's career. You know, I'm thinking like Jay-Z Nas and how, you know, Jay-Z coming out of that mostly unscathed and looking like the victor for as long as it went on, definitely painted the super successful trajectory that he, you know, sort of like launched off into post that. Meanwhile, Nas, like, while he is, like, you know, very much back on his feet and he's had those great records with Hit Boy, and, you know, he's obviously, like, you know, earned some Grammy wins and nods that are very much deserved, and his back catalog is very much seen as classic at this point. For a long time after, like, a lot of the records that he put out were not well viewed, not well, you know, reviewed, have sort of, like, you know, it's like he has this forgotten era in the middle of his catalog, and it's only been until the 2010s that he's kind of, like, bounced back. And, you know, when he did that record with Kanye, and again when he was working with Hit Boy, and people have been kind of, like, paying attention to him again, he's, like, more regularly in conversations, not just as a veteran artist who put out classic stuff back in the day, but, like, as a living artist who's still putting out good stuff. There's that. You know, you just mentioned 50 Cent. One of the last more consequential rap beefs that I can think of was actually 50 Cent Kanye, when Kanye challenged him to sell more in the head-to-head on release day or release week when he was coming out with Graduation. And 50 Cent was coming out with the record that he did that I can't even remember at this point. That record flopped so hard, and so did every other album afterwards. And 50 Cent kind of fell off the radar at that point. And, you know, as you sort of say, like, the 50 Cent Ja Rule beef was also very consequential, and that Ja Rule was taken a lot less seriously after that whole ordeal. But these days, like, the rap beefs that we see and have been seeing, the consequences in terms of like, the success from an artist from that point forward, they're not really there. Drake has been allowed to just kind of continue as if, he's been completely unscathed by the whole Pusha T thing. The only person who brings up that instance or references back to it, or the person bringing it up the most in their own songs, is actually Drake. Like, Pusha T's last record didn't really touch down on that as many times as Drake's did. But, the thing is, like, a part of Drake's appeal, or a part of his overall narrative, is like how many people sort of like have it out for him. And he sort of likes to bring that up quite a bit, even if it doesn't really have, again, sort of like long-term consequences for his success. Other instances that I could think of are like the recent head-to-head that Nicki Minaj had with Megan Thee Stallion. Nicki came out of that looking very foolish, dropped one of the worst diss tracks in recent memory that, objective, fans could think of. But Nicki's career is still very much intact. All of her promises and threats to drop subsequent songs and disses and attacks have been pretty much forgotten. And she hasn't been, and nobody's been holding her feet to the fire on sort of like coming through with that. And I feel like we're kind of seeing a similar thing with this Kendrick and Cole, to do at the moment as well, because, Cole didn't even give this track a whole week to breathe before he was literally at a live show apologizing for putting it out. And I don't know if J. Cole's fans are going to turn on him as a result of that. I think he's just going to continue forward. I think Kendrick's just going to continue forward. Again, I don't blame you for kind of like noting this and paying attention to it. It's what a lot of people pay attention. It's drama, it's tension, it's whatever. And we come from an era when that was like, really pivotal and a part of hip hop's general lore. But I feel like the diss record, the beef record, as like I want to say like a tool, I think it's kind of like it's irrelevant at this point, because it doesn't really have kind of the actual quantifiable impact on an artist's career that it used to, in terms of making it or breaking it. Even if, like, again, in that Drake Push instance, like, you're totally left, like, falling flat on your face. And on top of it, like, the beefs don't really seem to last all that long anyway. Again, J. Cole, apology, ended it. It's gone. Nicki Minaj, as soon as she put out her awful track and there were repercussions for it, she ignored it, forgot about it, just stopped talking about it. Eminem keeps going at Benzino, and it's absolutely pitiful because he's beating a dead horse at this point, because there's nothing really Benzino can do or say that'll sort of like, really take him down or do anything to hurt him back. I'm just, these beefs, and again, with the Drake Pusha thing, Drake literally ended that shit with a press release. And put out a piece of paper, a statement being like, oh, we think this went too far, we're just going to end it now. It's like how, like, prior to that, you couldn't possibly name another rap beef that ended in a PR, like letter sent out to the press. And again, I can't really think of another rap beef that ended in the responder apologizing as soon as they put out the response. I think this current generation, and not that this isn't like sort of a boomer argument here, but I think like this current generation doesn't really have the stomach for that kind of like long, unending, multi-track sort of like feud that we used to see back in the day. And I don't think that's inherently a bad thing. Like I feel like ultimately it would be more tragic if, these sort of tensions rose and rose and rose to the point where, we saw people getting killed. We saw violence, obviously that would be worse. That would be a worse outcome. I feel like, but not only that, but I feel like another reason that we're not like, really seeing any hunger for this kind of prolonged sort of tension is like there's not really any necessity for it anymore in the current hip hop landscape. It used to be back in the day when hip hop was not sort of like, the top genre, that there was a limited pool of resources in terms of like listeners and, media time and radio time and, DJs playing your shit and so on and so forth. And the thing is like, you needed to compete in order to sort of prove yourself worthy of those slots, worthy of those spots, worthy of the album contract, worthy of the anything. And the thing is, like, these days, you don't even have to be good, to like get a record contract and have a #1 song and so on and so forth. Like, none of these rappers are coming up kind of, having their metal tested battle rapping in front of each other in order to make a living. In fact, like, that part of the culture is so separate from what we know as the mainstream right now. Battle rap is its own thing. You have battle rap, you have battle rappers who make a living or try to make a living battle rapping, and it's often more of a hindrance than it is a help for you to be a battle rapper professionally and try to make a transition into the commercial world. Like, I'm going to start making commercial records as a battle rapper. Usually we don't see a whole lot of crossover between those lanes these days. And one of the last and greatest, rappers to ever make that transition was probably Eminem. Eminem came up as a battle rapper and then obviously, transitioned into making commercial music and ended up being one of the most successful. And, maybe a more recent example would be Meek Mill. But the thing is, in today's hip hop landscape, even he is more of the exception than the rule. Tierra Whack as well, she's from Philly too, but, she seems to be pretty focused these days on experimenting with other genres other than rap. And there's like really no trace of her talents and capabilities as a battle rapper or as somebody who can rap competitively in a lot of her work, especially this new record, which is like very introspective and very much about kind of like diving into very dark feelings of depression and all of that. And I think that paradigm shift has come for a lot of reasons. It's partially it's partially changed because of guys like Drake, because of guys like J. Cole, because of guys like Kendrick, because some of the biggest and most popular and most, successful commercial works of these artists are not them sort of like, going at each other's throats or at the throats of other rappers, but them rapping about like what's torturing them. Oh, it's my ex-girlfriend. Oh, it's my drinking problem. Oh, it's my depression. Oh, it's like my imposter syndrome. Oh, it's like, this void that is left within me as I've kind of reached the top of success in the music industry. And now I don't really know what to do with myself. And I thought this would make me happy and it doesn't,
Right.
So, it only makes sense that, you would see artists at the top, but also, at this kind of like mid-tier underground range, not finding ways to sort of like tear their competition apart, but figuring out ways to emote more intensely in their music, or make something that's just going to be the hookiest earworm that you could possibly come up with. So yeah, while I think beef may not be going anywhere anytime soon, is sort of like an idea, something that we like allude to. Like, obviously, I don't think rappers are going to stop writing bars about people who hate them and people who count them out and people who sort of underrate them or disrespect them anytime soon. But, I think we're completely past the era where, we're going to see, multi-song disses going back and forth over and over and over and over, especially among artists who are in the mainstream. The only sort of corner of hip hop that I can think of right now that is regularly engaging in that for prolonged periods of time, multiple tracks, is probably the drill scene. And those dudes are literally fucking firing at each other. Those dudes are literally unloading clips on each other. And again, there's like, real life consequences for that stuff every day, every week, every month, every year. And I'm sure that, in the backs of some of these rappers' heads, like, they know on some level that things probably could be taken that far, if they decided to, I'm going to respond in this way and I'm going to respond in this way and I'm going to drag it out for months and weeks and this long or whatever, so ultimately it may not even really be worth it, because at the end of the day, for a guy like Drake, for a guy like J. Cole, doing a diss record, it's not gonna, if it does anything to their career positive, it may bring them 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 million more Spotify listeners. And at the end of the day, like, that doesn't mean 2 to 3 to 4 or $5 million in their pocket. You know what I mean? And even if it was that amount of money going in their pocket, would it even be worth it then? Because, these dudes are looking at the potential to continue doing this hip hop thing at the level that they are for the next maybe 5 to 10 years, considering the success that they've had up until this point. Like, they're going to make way more money doing that long term than they are sort of like focusing on, the immediacy of this this quarrel, this beef, this fight, this whatever that's in front of them right now.
Yeah, I mean, as I've listened to it more, I realize how much more this is less, and you tell me, but a sort of revitalization of that sort of era and more maybe a last gasp. Like even the Eazy-E sample, "He Was Once a Thug" from Around the Way, that was used on Riding Spinners. Like, it seems very aimed at me as a 35-year-old that likes that era of stuff, and it's interesting because I know J. Cole because Kendrick was featured. I'm a Kendrick guy. Like, I remember him, that early era. A Good Kid, Mad City was the first one I anticipated and listened to. And I mean, to me, and I'm 35, so I'm not listening for it like I was in my 20s. But like, Kendrick was sort of foretold as the guy he became. And so his verse now, it impressed me way more than even the Control verse did, which I think was I think is only notable in the way that Drake responded to it, because I thought it was kind of, let's go guys, we're all like competing like it's together. Whereas this was more, I think Kendrick, and then I want to talk about J. Cole a bit too, but Kendrick saying like, look, like, he can have all that success. And I'll be honest, I haven't been listening to a lot of Drake over the past years. I'm still Kendrick Lamar. And even if you don't like the introspective stuff, like, I can still go there in a way that these guys can't. And like, we know kind of about Drake. The J. Cole stuff is interesting to me because, like, I never have really listened to J. Cole outside of a Kendrick context, outside of the early features. But it was that made me respect J. Cole. And I was surprised by how sort of ready people were for his response. People kind of dismissed the idea Drake would have a big response. But I was impressed, frankly, by how sort of, because it's frankly, like, just not being as familiar, I class Kendrick higher than them. And I thought J. Cole's response wasn't actually super bad. I don't think it was great. I think it was kind of like rehashing similar themes, like going through the albums and rating them that people do on diss tracks. But I think it kept the ball in the air, and then he apologized for it. Right.
No, I think a lot of people were excited because, and to your point again, like, weren't expecting much from Drake because, in recent memory, we do again have that Pusha T thing. If Drake were to respond in kind to Kendrick, or, in an even more pronounced way with an entire 2 tracks or a couple tracks in the same way that he did Meek Mill, there is the chance that things would escalate to the point where he would put out another PR statement and be like, okay, things have gotten too crazy. We're just going to back off. It's over. I mean, I feel like Drake, as much as he does reference that beef over and over and how, I'm going to get revenge one day, like the Scorpio that he is, I think, at the end of the day, I feel like that's the ultimate lesson that he took away from that whole thing. That, like, my career and making money and being successful is more important than any of these, sort of like back and forths. However, with Cole, a lot of people see Cole as kind of like I don't personally, but a lot of people see Cole as kind of like a kindred spirit to Kendrick Lamar. Back in the day when they were both coming up, there was like this long rumored, and both of them, I think, had even referenced it at one point, like this long rumored project where they were going to collab for an entire tape or an entire album. Like, after a while, like, people kind of gave up hope on it. I think it was even maybe formally announced at one point that it just like wasn't going to happen. But, people have kind of seen them as kind of creatively similar to each other because, they both make, introspective music that's kind of cerebral and heady and addresses social issues, and they're both lyrical and they're both passionate, and, they're both like, guys who are kind of in their own heads. And, but personally, I don't think they're that similar, as they both continue to sort of like release albums that I think diverge even further from each other artistically. But still, I think there are a lot of people that have memories of that time and memories of that era, and to think that, like, as far as the commercial side of the very top spots of hip hop go, like, J. Cole is probably one of the only artists who could contend with Kendrick Lamar lyrically. And I think on some level that is true. However, I think it was pretty clear from J. Cole's response that we didn't get the best performance because he wasn't actually enthusiastic about doing what he did on that track. And his performance, his delivery, and his writing wasn't as good as it typically is on songs where he clearly does have drive and does have an interest in doing what he does. Be that on a song like Johnny P's Caddy, or be that like on First Person Shooter, or, be that even on like, False Prophets, which, if you're unfamiliar with the J. Cole catalog, is a diss record in and of itself, but it's a diss record about Kanye. But it's not like your typical diss record. It's more of like, and this was years and years ago. This is like a record where he's kind of like unpacking the idea of Kanye as sort of like a leader, a messiah of hip hop, somebody who, you sort of like have faith in, who you believe in, but simultaneously he's deeply flawed and he has a lot of problems and he's hypocritical and you can't really trust him to follow through with anything. You don't really know if anything that he's saying, anything that's coming out of his mouth has any factual basis, and you just kind of end up, extremely disappointed in the guy. So that's a diss record that he is actually incredibly well written and well put together, and actually kind of dissects Kanye in a very effective way. But it's not like, it's kind of different in tone because it's not like aggressively seeking a response from him. You know what I mean? It's just like, this is my observation on the guy and his inability to sort of like keep it together. So it's like J. Cole has the capacity when he wants to pull somebody apart, but, part of his motivation was because he obviously looked up to the guy. It wasn't like, I'm going to go at him because he's my competition. I'm kind of going at him because I looked up at him. A lot of J. Cole's early work is obviously, J. Cole, not just a rapper, but as a rapper producer as well, looked up to him and, kind of dissected him from that point of view, from somebody who admired him and then became, sort of disillusioned with him. So, again, he has the capacity to break somebody down when he wants to, but in this case, I just don't think he really wanted to. So, we kind of got the results that we did.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty interesting. Like, you got dragged out into the part of the. I'm curious how Kendrick, if he's just going to leave it there or and just say like, I guess I took care of that.
I don't know if there's really any reason for him to add anything to this. I mean, frankly, like I'm not surprised, but at least from my perspective, like the line initially he was responding to from J. Cole, the Big Three thing,
right,
I mean, was a positive citation of him coming from J. Cole. Even though I can acknowledge that, like, he's won this round, but simultaneously, like, that was kind of a dick move. There was really no impetus for you to attack the guys in that way. I mean, here and there might have, been some shots from Drake in the past because there is, definitely tension there between these two different sections of hip hop, where you have artists that are just like kind of in it for the charts and are in it for, the commercial appeal like Drake, and artists who are obviously trying to make something more substantive like Kendrick. Kendrick kind of going at Cole inadvertently or, inadvertently in that way is kind of like friendly fire a little bit, because it's like, even if I do agree with the sentiment that like Kendrick typically makes better albums than Cole, like he's still trying, you know what I mean? Like he's not exactly out here just like trying to make garbage, radio records or just albums that are going to sound good on Rap Caviar, he's actually trying his best to make something substantive, and he clearly admires you, it's like, I don't know if you need to like fucking throw him under the bus like that. It was a bit of a throw him under the bus kind of moment. And, the thing is like, yeah. I feel like if J. Cole kind of came out like he did this past weekend, rather than doing a response track, it might have left Kendrick, looking like a bit of a dick, because it is kind of true. J. Cole has done nothing to sort of like, warrant that kind of response. He hasn't been going at Kendrick. Like, he clearly loves the guy's work. And, I was kind of amazed that Kendrick ended up coming out of this looking like, a total winner, despite the fact that like he really kind of aggressed out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And not even in a way, the control verse that you mentioned earlier, while he didn't name a lot of names in that verse, like it did at least a little bit sort of like seem like in the competition of in the spirit of competition with my generation. Like I'm mentioning these guys. See, the difference in tone there is like he's clearly mentioning those guys because he sees them as his competition, and he sees like, while he does in his heart of hearts feel like he can outdo them and he has the potential to sort of like clear all of them out, like he also sees them, and if he, as a threat on some level. If he didn't, I don't think he would have named them. Meanwhile, in the Big Three verse, he's literally like, no, you guys are nowhere the fuck near me. I am in my own lane. I'm in my own category. Like, don't even mention my name. Yeah. It's like, wow.
And
Okay,
it goes so perfectly.
That's like a totally different Kendrick.
It goes so perfectly with the theme of the Future album too. I love that they did that with all like the claustrophobic leading right into it.
right. No, for sure.
Okay, so I want to.
Wow. So if you were intrigued there and you were hoping to see more of that, Matt, where should people go?
Patreon.com/Left Reckoning. That will be released in full for our patrons as the Sunday show. We get into the Rick Rubin, this producer, kind of people know him. I feel like I first heard of the sort of guru reputation of Rick Rubin as this music guy. I think he did Dirt Off Your Shoulder. I'm doing this without checking, but I think he did Dirt Off Your Shoulder, Jay-Z. I think he was in that video even. And he's a big alt-right guy. big stupid asshole, like just retweeting Mike Cernovich. And it's funny, like I tell Anthony in the interview, you like to think that guys like that, like it's one thing to be a secret right-wing guy or even like a not secret. Actually, no, but it's like when they go public and you realize, oh, you don't have any sort of like boutique right-wing sort of thought purveyors. It's just the same fucking morons, and you just like buy into them. It's weird because like I'm reflecting on age a lot, I guess, lately. But like as I get older, I realize like a guy like Steve Pinker, people familiar with his work, but like he's a moron apologist for the status quo, in my opinion, and like he's not nearly as learned as. Like for some reason, like to me, it's that being like a 20-year-old seeing Steven Pinker and sort of seeing through that was very empowering to me. I'm like, oh yeah, I can see through it. Now it kind of terrifies me because you realize that everybody is relying on morons like that to guide them through the world, and it sucks. And so yeah, Rick Rubin, we get into that, and we also talk about streaming economics.
Well. Y'all won't want to miss that. You get that at patreon.com/Left Reckoning, but you don't got to wait till Sunday. We're going to go over the postgame patreon.com/Left Reckoning to get that. We have some fun things going on there as well.
We have speaking of a guru, Joe Rogan. This is a very funny clip of Joe Rogan talking to comedians about Jordan Peterson and being too precious about his buddy to comedians who aren't really there for it, who are even like not sympathetic, but like empathetic, maybe like, okay, you can speak yourself out on this. And it is I don't know, it's beautiful to see Joe just needlessly crowbar his ideological fixations into conversations with actually funny people. But patreon.com/Left Reckoning. I'll talk about Mayor Fry, that clip we opened the show with, and his minimum wage stuff, and more.
Yeah. So folks, patreon.com/Left Reckoning. Please, do go out and check out the work of our guests. It's very important. We'll be over the post game in just a few minutes. So join up. We'll see you there.
Yeah, no, folks, I want to underline that last comment. Next time I want to check Soberania, their subscriber list. I want to see it jump. I want to see a Left Reckoning bump there. So when you finish watching this, go do that, and we'll see you in the post game in a little bit.